Hi, there's a little book I discovered on Google Books which I want to share with you. It's called a Self Instructing Latin Dialectus, and it's quite a useful book for a student of Latin. Here's the title page, the Self Instructing Latin Classic, in 2 volumes. Both volumes are printed together in this edition that's on Google. It was written by one W. Jacobs, private teacher of mathematics and classics, author of The Mysteries of the Latin Language Revealed, London 1841. This is a sort of a slightly quirky text. There are many interesting and quirky texts available on Google, books that were printed using all kinds of different pedagogical methods. This one uses something that's close to a serial method anyway, not serial and oral, but a serial method. The book starts out with a very brief outline of Latin grammar, and then it adopts extremely traditional syllabus, beginning with fables, as was the case with Latin education for thousands of years, right until, the mid-1800s. The beginning student of Latin would start their studies with fables. This is fallen out of fashion. And the way that Jacobs does it is he gives you the fable, as we see here, and then he gives you a literal phrase-by-phrase translation, which is on the facing page. I'll show you this now. And here we have Jacobs' very literal translation that follows the order of the Latin. So with the translation, you can work out the structure, the grammatical structure of the Latin. Following a collection of fables, Jacobs then takes the next step, which was a very traditional step in the English Latin curriculum in the 1700s and 1800s, which is to introduce the student to the plays of Terence, in the belief that this would then give the student some kind of grip on the conversational language. Terence and Plautus were very much studied in the beginning, because at this period it was still important, and Jacobs has inherited this older curriculum. It was important to acquire facility in the spoken language, because if you wanted to go to university until the end of the 1600s, mid-1700s, it was still very useful to be able to speak in Latin if you wanted to converse with your intellectual peers in continental Europe. Here we can see the very literal translation that Jacobs gives, phrase by phrase, which matches the Latin on the facing page. Following this, we have some excerpts from Latin authors. Sallust, to start with. After Sallust, we have some Caesar. And after Caesar, we are introduced to Cicero. Following quite a large chunk of Cicero, we are given principles of Latin composition, how to begin to write in Latin. Following the syntax, which is presented in an accessible way, an introduction is given to prosody, which is verse. And I think that Jacobs actually makes quite a good job of it. Having read a number of introductions to Latin verse, this is one of the better ones. And here's Jacobs' introduction to Latin verse. It's very interesting what he's done here. As you can see, we have arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam fato profagus lavinia venit littera. Now notice with multum, he's put the into italics, showing us that there is an elision. So multille teris iactatus et alto. And he does this again in line 7. Albanique patres atqualtae moenia Romae, where the final E of atque is in italics. This helps you to see what's going on with the elisions in the poetry, and all of the long syllables are noted. The long vowels, anyway, are noted. On the facing page, as with all of the Latin provided by Jacobs, we have a extremely literal phrase-by-phrase translation that matches the corresponding Latin word for word. Following on from Virgil, we are introduced to Ovid. And following Ovid, Horace. Finally, the book terminates in a second essay on prosody, which is well worth reading. I think that Jacobs and what he has to say here is of use to any student of Latin. So to conclude, all in all, this is a very interesting Latin textbook, one of the more interesting Latin textbooks I've come across. It does give an overview of Latin grammar, but the focus is on learning the language through the medium of the language and not through the medium of rules, although the rules are provided as we go on. The rules are really only talked about once the student has read quite a large amount of Latin in this very particular way that it's laid out by Jacobs. I do propose at some point to make a recording of this book because I think it's a very useful review text, even for a more advanced student of Latin, and it's useful to read through and listen to the presentation of grammar by different grammarians, because they always have a different way of putting things, and sometimes what one grammarian says makes perfect sense, and the way another grammarian puts it makes it obtuse. So it's worth reading a wide variety of texts and not rely on one grammar text for your language instruction. So this book, the Self Instructing Latin Classic, or the Self Instructing Latin Dialectus by Jacobs, which is found on Google Books, I highly recommend it to you. Of the various finds that I've made on Google, this is one of the good ones. Bye.